kid behind the counter held the 2 sets of dog tags up to the fluorescent lights by the chain, let them dangle and clink together, and dropped them back on the glass. "Yeah, old dog tags. We get these all the time. Estate sales, storage units, whatever. I can do $8. Clyde Embry stood on the other side of the counter. 84 years old, the worn brown leather bomber jacket he'd been wearing since 1979, zipped to the collar because the Florida morning had a chill that shouldn't have been there in October, the 2 sets of tarnished dog tags on a single beaded chain lying on the glass between them, and watched a 23-year-old in a Crown Pawn polo look at the last physical evidence of his father's war and see $8 worth of stamped tin. "Those were my daddy's," Clyde said, quiet. The kid, Riggs by the crooked name tag, shrugged and pushed the tags an inch across the glass with his index finger. "Sure, 8, final." Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. There were 2 sets of dog tags on that chain. One set belonged to Clyde's father, Sergeant William D. Embry, 28th Infantry Division, serial number 33487-012. The other set belonged to a man named James Dalton Oakes, PFC, same regiment, serial number 335-12076. James Dalton Oakes had been killed in action in the Hurtgen Forest on November 6, 1944, at the age of 19. His body had been recovered. His personal effects had not. His family, a mother and 2 sisters in Shelbyville, Tennessee, had received the telegram and the flag, but never the tags. For 80 years, the Oakes family had lived without the small proof that their son and brother had existed in the Army's own metal. William Embry had carried both sets of tags home from the war. He had never told his wife why there were 2 sets. He had never told his son. He had put them in the drawer of his nightstand in 1945 and had left them there for 47 years until his death in 1992. And when Clyde had cleaned out the nightstand, he had found the 2 sets on a single chain and had assumed, as sons do, that the Army had simply issued his father a spare. The tags on the counter at Crown Pawn on Davis Highway in Pensacola, Florida, on that Tuesday morning in October were about to be appraised, together with their provenance, at $67,000. But the real value was not in the money. The real value was in the second name. The name of a 19-year-old boy from Shelbyville, Tennessee, whose family had been waiting 80 years for someone to bring him home. This is the story of how Clyde Embry walked into Crown Pawn with $460 of trouble in his head and walked out with 2 men's lives, his father's and a stranger's, finally understood. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Clyde. Clyde William Embry was born in 1940 in Pensacola, Florida. His father, William Daniel Embry, had been a Pensacola boy who'd enlisted in '42 at 22, served with the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, Pennsylvania National Guard, through Normandy, through the hedgerows, through the Hurtgen Forest, through the Bulge, and come home in '45 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a silence that lasted the rest of his life. William had worked as a diesel mechanic at the Pensacola Naval Air Station Civilian Yard for 39 years. He had married Clyde's mother, Pauline, in 1939. He had raised Clyde and Clyde's sister, June. He had not spoken of the war. When Clyde, at 13, had asked his father what he'd done in Europe, William had looked at him over the top of the Pensacola News-Journal and said, "I did what they told me, son. I came home. That's the whole story." Clyde had served in the Navy himself. 4 years, 58 to 62, radio man aboard the USS Intrepid. He'd come home and spent 37 years as an electrician at Sacred Heart Hospital. Married Annie Rutledge in 1963. 1 son, William, named for Clyde's father, now 60 and living in Tallahassee. Annie had died in 2021 of a heart attack at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning, mid-bite, gone before Clyde could stand up. The car repair was the problem. It was the 2004 Buick LeSabre, Annie's car, the car she'd picked out, the car Clyde had kept running for her and then for himself, had thrown a head gasket in September. The estimate from Gonzalez Automotive was $460 for the gasket and the labor. Without the car, Clyde couldn't get to his VA appointments at the Pensacola Outpatient Clinic, or to the Winn-Dixie, or to Sacred Heart Baptist, where he'd sat in the same pew for 41 years. His Navy pension was $420 a month. Social Security was $2,280. After the property taxes on the small concrete block house on Barrancas Avenue, the homeowner's insurance, which had jumped twice since the last hurricane, his Medicare supplement, his blood pressure and cholesterol medications, and the groceries, he had about $60 of slack in a good month. He did not have $460. He could have called William in Tallahassee. William was a state employee, Florida Department of Transportation, good benefits but government salary, with 2 kids, one at FSU and one starting at Pensacola State in the spring. Clyde had not asked his son for $1 in 22 years. He was not going to start over a head gasket. For 11 days, he walked the 1.5 miles to the Winn-Dixie and caught rides to church with his neighbor Mrs. Tran and postponed his VA appointment. On the 12th morning, Tuesday, he opened his father's nightstand. The nightstand was a small walnut 2-drawer piece William had built himself in 1952 from scrap lumber at the NAS yard. Clyde had moved it to his own bedroom after William's death in 1992. In the top drawer, where it had been for 47 years, was the beaded chain with the 2 sets of tags, 2 rectangular pieces of stamped aluminum, notched at one end, strung on a single stainless steel beaded chain. The tags were tarnished but legible. The first set read, Embry William D. 33487 012 T43A POS C Catholic. The second set read, Oakes James D. 335 12 076 T43B Negi P Protestant. Clyde had looked at both sets when he'd found them in 1992. He had read the second name, Oakes James D., and had assumed, without thinking much about it, that his father had been issued a Buddy's spare set for some logistical reason, or that the Army had simply given him 2 sets by mistake. He had put them back in the drawer and had not thought about it again in 32 years. William Daniel Embry had been the kind of father who showed up. He had coached Clyde's Babe Ruth League team for 4 summers. He had built the back porch with his own hands on 3 consecutive Saturdays in 1958. He had driven Clyde to the Navy recruiting office in 1958 and shaken his hand in the parking lot and said, "You come home, son," and that was all. He had driven to the airport to pick Clyde up 4 years later and shaken his hand again and said, "Welcome home, son," and that was all again. He was not a man of many words. He was a man of reliable hands. But there was a drawer in his nightstand that he never opened when anyone was in the room. Clyde's mother Pauline had mentioned it once. "Your daddy has his private things in that drawer, Clyde. You leave it be." And Clyde had left it be for 50 years. He had assumed the drawer contained his father's bronze star, his Purple Heart, maybe a letter or 2. When he had finally opened the drawer in 1992, the day after William's funeral, he had found the tags, the medals, a folded V-mail letter from 1944 that was too faded to read, and a small black and white photograph of 4 soldiers standing in front of a stone wall. On the back of the photograph, in his father's careful block print, Schmidt Farm, November 3rd, 44. Me, Oakes, Kopinski, Davis, 3 days before the Hurtgen. Clyde had looked at the photograph. He had not known which face was Oakes. He had put everything back in the drawer and closed it. He sat at the kitchen table with the tags in front of him and the Gonzalez Automotive estimate 3 inches from his coffee mug, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He put the tags in the pocket of his bomber jacket and drove Mrs. Tran's Honda to town. Mrs. Tran had said, take it, bring it back whenever." Crown Pawn sat on Davis Highway, between a Popeyes and a check-cashing place. The bell over the door jangled as Clyde stepped inside. Riggs was behind the counter on his phone and looked up after about 7 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got some old dog tags, my daddy's, from the Second World War." "Let's see 'em." Clyde took the beaded chain out of his jacket pocket and set it on the glass. The 2 sets of tags clinked softly against each other. Riggs picked them up by the chain, held them up to the fluorescent lights, squinted at the stamped text. "Yeah, dog tags. We get these. Vets' kids bring 'em in, estate sales, storage unit cleanouts. Some of 'em are worth a few bucks to collectors if they're Korean War or Vietnam. World War II is... there's a million of 'em. $8. Those are real. My daddy wore those in combat. Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge." "Sure, Pops." Riggs dropped the tags on the glass from about 4 inches up. They clinked and slid. $8. I can't sell stories, you know. I can sell metal. $8 of metal. He picked up one tag, the Oaks tag, and bent it slightly between his thumb and forefinger, testing the flex of the aluminum. Clyde heard a small metallic creak. "Son, please don't bend those." "It's aluminum, Pops. It bends back." Riggs let the tag spring flat. He picked up the chain again and swung it in a lazy circle around his index finger. The tags clattered together with each rotation. $8. Take it or leave it." Clyde's jaw set. He put both hands flat on the counter. He thought about his father at the breakfast table in 1953, reading the Pensacola News Journal, not talking about Europe. He thought about Annie at her breakfast table. He thought about the car sitting dead in the driveway with her rosary still hanging from the rearview mirror. He did not pick up the tags. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight, because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 23-year-old, and Clyde Embry had not cried in front of another human being since Annie's funeral in 2021. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in, late 50s, tall, ramrod-straight posture, high and tight gray haircut going white at the temples, clean-shaven, sharp jawline, pale blue eyes. He wore a navy blue windbreaker with a small embroidered American flag on the left breast over a white polo shirt, pressed khaki trousers, and polished brown shoes. He carried a small olive-drab canvas field bag, the kind the Army hadn't issued since the 1960s, slung over one shoulder. He came 2 steps inside, glanced at the counter, and stopped. He looked at the dog tags on the glass. He looked at them for a long time. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was level and quiet, with the careful cadence of a man who had spent decades giving orders and had learned that the quieter you speak, the harder people listen. "Sir, are those World War II dog tags?" Riggs looked up. "Old guy's selling. $8. The man did not look at Riggs. He looked at Clyde. "Sir, my name is Colonel David Parrish, United States Army, retired, 31 years. I now serve as the Senior Historical Advisor to the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, and I consult for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. I'm in Pensacola this week for a meeting at NAS Pensacola with the Marine Corps History Division. I came in here because I collect old military field manuals. Would you permit me to examine those tags?" Clyde found his voice. "You're asking me?" "They're yours, aren't they?" "They were my daddy's." "Then yes, sir. I'm asking you, and I would ask you, please, not to let anyone bend or swing those tags again." Riggs stopped spinning the chain and set it on the glass without being told twice. Something about the way the colonel had said please had the weight of a direct order behind it. Colonel Parrish set his olive-drab canvas bag on the counter and unbuckled the flap. He drew out a pair of folded white cotton archival gloves, a 10x jeweler's loop, a small LED maglite, a soft chamois, and a leather-bound field notebook. He pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I?" Clyde nodded. Colonel Parrish picked up the beaded chain with both gloved hands and laid the 2 sets of tags side by side on the chamois. He read the first tag through the loop. He read the second tag through the loop. He shone the flashlight at a grazing angle across the stamped text, reading the depth and consistency of the die strike. He set the loop down. He read the second tag again without it. He read the serial number. He read the blood type. He read the name. Oakes James D. He went still. Mr. Embry. Clyde Embry. Mr. Embry. The first set of tags on this chain, Embry William D., serial number 334870012, T43, a positive Catholic, is a standard issue 1943 pattern identification tag. The serial number prefix 33 indicates enlistment in the state of Pennsylvania. The T43 indicates the year of the tetanus immunization, 1943. These are your father's tags. Clyde nodded. The second set, Oakes James D., serial number 335120076, T43, B negative, Protestant, is also a standard issue 1943 identification tag with a Pennsylvania enlistment prefix. Colonel Parrish looked at Clyde. Mr. Embry, do you know who James D. Oakes was? No, sir. I found both sets in my daddy's nightstand after he died in '92. I figured the Army gave him a spare or there was some kind of mix-up. Colonel Parrish closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his voice had not changed in volume, but it had changed in weight. Mr. Embry, the DPAA maintains a database of every American service member killed in action, missing in action, or unaccounted for from every conflict since World War I. I can tell you, without checking the database, because I have read this name before, that Private First Class James Dalton Oakes, serial number 335120076, was a member of the 28th Infantry Division. He was 19 years old. He was from Shelbyville, Tennessee. He was killed in action on November 6, 1944, in the Hurtgen Forest, Germany. His body was recovered and identified. He is buried at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. His personal effects, including his identification tags, were listed as not recovered with remains. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. His family, a mother named Ruth Oakes and two sisters, Mary and Catherine, received the War Department telegram on November 19, 1944. They received the flag. They received the Purple Heart. They never received his tags. Riggs had stopped moving. Mr. Embry, your father and James Oakes served in the same division. The serial number sequence and the T43 immunization date suggest they may have been in the same regiment or even the same company. Your father survived the Hurtgen Forest. James Oakes did not. At some point during or after the battle, and I will not speculate on the circumstances because the circumstances of the Hurtgen Forest were beyond anything I can describe to you in a pawn shop, your father took James Oakes's identification tags off the body of a boy who was dead, put them on his own chain, and carried them home. Clyde sat down on the stool beside the counter. He never told me, Clyde said. He never said the name. He never said anything about Europe. Men who fought in the Hurtgen often didn't, sir. The 28th Division lost over 6,000 men in 3 weeks in those woods. The forest was so dense, the artillery burst in the treetops and rained shrapnel straight down. The mud was knee-deep. The temperature was below freezing. There were no front lines. The division that went in came out a different division. Many of the men who survived never spoke of it again. Colonel Parrish picked up the Oakes tag and held it in the fluorescent light. There's something else I need to tell you, sir. James Oakes's mother, Ruth, died in 1988 without ever receiving her son's tags. His sister Mary died in 2004. His sister Catherine Oakes Ballard, is alive. She is 93 years old. She lives in a nursing home in Shelbyville, Tennessee. She has been waiting 80 years for somebody to bring her brother's tags home. Nobody in the shop spoke. A car horn sounded twice on Davis Highway and stopped. Colonel Parrish set the tag down on the chamois. He looked at Clyde. Mr. Embry, at professional appraisal, as a documented paired tag set from the same chain with one tag belonging to a KIA soldier whose effects were officially listed as unrecovered and with provenance to a surviving soldier from the same unit, These tags together would be valued for institutional acquisition between $55,000 and $80,000. Conservative estimate, $67,000. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Henri Chapelle Visitor Center would both be interested. He paused. But I want to tell you something else, sir. You have a choice. You can sell these tags to a museum, or you can do what I believe your father would have done if he'd had the words to do it. You can give James Oakes's tags back to his sister. Clyde looked at the two tags on the chamois, his father's, and a boy named James. He thought about his father at the nightstand in 1945, putting both sets of tags in the top drawer, closing the drawer, and never opening it again. He thought about what it cost a man to carry another man's name in his pocket for 47 years and never explain why. He thought about a 19-year-old boy in the Hurtgen forest in November of 1944, in the mud and the tree-burst shrapnel and the freezing dark, and a 24-year-old sergeant kneeling beside him and taking the tags off a body that was no longer a body, but was still a boy. William Embry had not been able to save James Oakes. So he had saved his name. He had carried it home. He had kept it in the drawer beside his bed for the rest of his life, and he had never told anyone because the men of the Hurtgen did not tell. "Colonel," Clyde said. He said it quiet. "I'd like to take James's tags to Shelbyville myself." Colonel Parrish nodded once. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Clyde took the tags from the chamois with both hands. He unclasped the beaded chain and separated the two sets. He put his father's tags in his left jacket pocket. He put James Oakes's tags in his right jacket pocket. He stood up from the stool. He nodded once at Colonel Parrish. He walked out past Riggs without a word. Riggs, behind the counter, said nothing. For once in his life, he did not have a number. In the parking lot, sitting in Mrs. Tran's Honda with the engine running and the Florida sun coming through the windshield, Clyde Embry held both sets of tags, one in each hand, and cried for the first time since Annie's funeral. He called William that night. William drove down from Tallahassee at 5 the next morning. They sat at the kitchen table on Barrancas Avenue, and Clyde told him the whole story. William, who had been named for a grandfather he'd never asked enough questions about, sat with both hands flat on the table and did not speak for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Colonel Parrish. Colonel Parrish made 2 phone calls. The first was to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which agreed to acquire Sergeant William Embry's tags, the first set, the father's set, for permanent display through a 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Embry family $61,000. The second phone call was to the Morningside Assisted Living Center in Shelbyville, Tennessee. 3 weeks later, Clyde Embry drove to Shelbyville. William went with him. They drove 11 hours in William's truck, across the Florida Panhandle, through Alabama, up through Mississippi into Tennessee, the miles and the pine trees and the small towns going by in silence. They pulled into the parking lot of the Morningside at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday in November. Colonel Parrish met them at the front door. He had arrived an hour earlier. He had brought a small folding American flag in a triangular walnut case, which he set on the table inside the entrance without saying anything about it. He had driven up from Pensacola. He was wearing his dress uniform. Catherine Oakes Ballard was 93 years old. She was in a wheelchair by the window of her room on the second floor. She was small and white-haired, and her eyes were the pale blue of a woman who has been looking out windows for a very long time. A framed photograph of a young man in uniform, her brother James, age 18, 1943, sat on the windowsill beside a small American flag. Clyde knelt beside her wheelchair. He took the second set of tags from his jacket pocket, Oakes James D. 33512-076, T43, B. Neg. P. Protestant, and he put them in her hands. "Ma'am," Clyde said, "my daddy carried these home for your brother. He kept them for 47 years. I've kept them for 32 more. I'm sorry it took so long." Catherine Oakes Ballard looked at the tags in her hands. She read her brother's name. She read his serial number. She turned the tag over. She held it against her chest. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I've been waiting for these since 1944. Colonel Parrish, standing in the doorway in his dress uniform, saluted. He held the salute until Catherine looked up at him. She nodded once. He dropped his hand. The Shelbyville Times-Gazette ran the story the following Monday. The Pensacola News-Journal picked it up. The Nashville Tennessean ran it. The AP Wire carried it nationally. CNN ran a 90-second segment. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans dedicated the display of Sergeant Embry's tags in January. A small case in the museum's Hurtgen Forest Gallery, beside a photograph of the 28th Division's positions in November 1944, with a placard, identification tags, Sergeant William D. Embry, 28th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, Normandy, Hurtgen Forest, Battle of the Bulge, 1944 to 1945. Sergeant Embry carried home the identification tags of PFC James Dalton Oakes, KAA November 6, 1944, Hurtgen Forest, alongside his own on a single chain for 47 years. Oakes's tags were returned to his surviving sister in Shelbyville, Tennessee, in November 2024, 80 years after his death. On loan from the family of Clyde W. Embry, Pensacola, Florida. Clyde paid for the head gasket. He paid the property taxes 2 years forward. He paid down what was left of Annie's burial expenses. He sent William $20,000 in Tallahassee and told him to use it for the boys' school and not to argue. He bought Annie a new headstone with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother. She was the best morning I ever had." Catherine Oakes Ballard died in March of the following year at 94, in the same room at the Morningside, with her brother's dog tags in the top drawer of her nightstand, the same drawer Clyde's father had kept them in for 47 years, and Clyde had kept them in for 32. Her niece, Mary's daughter, a woman named Helen Oakes Pryor in Nashville, wrote to Clyde in April. She wrote that Catherine had held the tags every day. She wrote that Catherine had told the staff at the Morningside that her brother had finally come home. She wrote that when Catherine died, the tags were in her hand. Clyde read the letter 3 times. He put it in the nightstand drawer where the tags had been. And the next Sunday morning, back home in Pensacola, Clyde sat down at his usual booth at the Waffle House on Navy Boulevard with his 2 oldest friends, Ray Thibodeau and Junior Presley, the way he had every Sunday for 28 years. Ray looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the News-Journal, Clyde." "Heard that. Hurtgen Forest, huh?" "Hurtgen Forest." Junior shook his head. $8. $8, Clyde agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at those tags and said $8. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.